Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The figures in the cornfield. When I was 17, I spent the summer working on my uncle's farm. It was grueling work, but I didn't mind. The fresh air and open skies were a welcome change from the cramped apartment where I lived with my parents. The farm itself was picturesque, surrounded by rolling fields of corn that seemed to stretch on forever. One evening, after a long day of work, my uncle and I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea and watching the sun set behind the fields. The golden light bathed the rows of corn in a warm glow, and the gentle rustle of the stalks in the breeze was almost hypnotic. That's when I saw them. At first I thought they were just shadows cast by the swaying corn, but as I squinted, I realized they were moving. Tall, thin figures gliding silently between the rows. Their movements were smooth, almost unnatural, as though they weren't walking so much as floating. "Uncle Pete," I said, my voice wavering, "do you see that?" He didn't even look. "Don't worry about it," he said gruffly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Just stay out of the fields after dark." I wanted to press him for more information, but the hard edge in his voice stopped me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't get the image of the figures out of my mind. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but deep down I didn't believe it. The next night, I was alone on the porch when the figures appeared again. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen. Their pale outlines barely visible in the dim light. They moved in unison, weaving between the stalks in a way that made my skin crawl. I stood up, my heart pounding, and stepped off the porch. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. "Who's out there?" The figures stopped. The air grew still, the rustling of the corn ceasing abruptly. For a moment the silence was deafening. Then, slowly, one of the figures turned, its face, or what should have been its face, tilting toward me. It was featureless, its surface smooth and pale like porcelain. I ran inside, locking the door behind me. My uncle found me pacing the kitchen, my face pale. "What did I tell you?" he said, his voice low and tense. "Don't look for them. Don't call out to them." "What are they?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he poured himself a drink, staring out the window at the darkened fields. "They've been here longer than the farm," he said finally. "Longer than me, longer than anyone. They don't bother us if we leave them be. So you leave them be." For the rest of the summer, I avoided the fields after sunset. But sometimes, when the wind died down and the night was eerily quiet, I'd hear faint whispers drifting from the corn, soft, unintelligible murmurs that sent chills down my spine. I never went back to the farm after that summer. My uncle passed away a few years later and the farm was sold. But whenever I drive past cornfields, I can't help but scan the rows for movement, half expecting to see those pale, featureless figures gliding silently through the stalks. The motel room. I was on a road trip driving across the country to start a new job in a different state. It was late, and I was exhausted from hours behind the wheel. The interstate stretched on endlessly, and every mile seemed darker and emptier than the last. When I saw the flickering neon sign for a roadside motel, I decided to stop for the night. The building was run down. its paint peeling, and the parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. But I was too tired to care. All I needed was a bed. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as I checked in, sliding me a key with a faint, mumbled warning. "Room 6. Keep the door locked." I nodded, brushing off his tone as nothing more than boredom or indifference. The room itself was as shabby as the rest of the motel, a sagging bed, yellowed wallpaper, and a faint smell of mildew. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and collapsed onto the bed. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. A faint knock at the door. I froze, my heart pounding. It was late, and I hadn't seen another car in the parking lot. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then the knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. I got out of bed, grabbing my phone as I approached the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. The hallway outside was empty. I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. But just as I turned to grab my bag, the knocking started again, this time at the window. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was outside was trying to break through. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys, threw open the door, and sprinted to my car. As I sped out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Someone, or something, was standing in the doorway of room 6, its form silhouetted against the faint light from the flickering sign. It didn't move, didn't follow me. It just stood there, watching until the motel disappeared into the darkness behind me. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, and though I've stayed in dozens of motels since, I always check the windows and doors twice, remembering the faint, steady knock that almost made me stay. The library basement. I was a graduate student working late nights in the university library, trying to finish my thesis on local folklore. The library was old, a massive Gothic structure with vaulted ceilings, rows of towering bookshelves, and endless corridors that seemed to lead nowhere. It had a charm that felt like stepping into another time, but at night, it was unsettlingly quiet. One of my favorite places to work was a small reading room on the 3rd floor, tucked away from the busier sections of the library. That night, as I sifted through a stack of dusty books, the librarian approached me. She was a petite woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and a face that seemed perpetually stern. "We'll be closing in an hour," she said, her voice low. "If you need anything else, you'll have to find it quickly." I nodded, thanking her, and she walked away. As I packed up my things, I remembered a book I'd read about in a reference guide, one that might contain information crucial to my research. It was listed as being in the basement archives, a part of the library I'd never been to. When I asked the librarian for access, she hesitated. "The basement?" she repeated, her tone unusually sharp. "It's not a place students are encouraged to go." "But I need it for my thesis," I insisted. "It's important." She sighed, studying me for a moment before relenting. "Fine," she said, "but be quick, and if you hear anything strange, come back immediately." I didn't ask what she meant. I followed her to a heavy wooden door at the end of a long hallway. She unlocked it with a large brass key, the door creaking loudly as it swung open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Leave the door open," she instructed, "and don't wander." The air grew colder as I descended, the scent of damp stone and old paper filling my nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs was a long corridor lined with shelves, each one crammed with books and documents that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I found the section I needed quickly, the spines of the books coated in a thick layer of dust. As I flipped through one of the volumes, I heard it. A faint whisper, just barely audible over the silence. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty corridor. The whispering stopped. I told myself it was just the sound of the building settling, or maybe the wind outside. But as I turned back to the book, the whispering started again, louder this time, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as I stood there, torn between curiosity and fear. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, my footsteps muffled by the cold, uneven stone floor. The corridor twisted and turned, the shelves growing sparser as I went. Eventually, I reached the end. A blank stone wall, bare except for a single book lying open on the floor. The whispering stopped the moment I stepped closer. I knelt to pick up the book, my hands trembling. Its pages were blank, save for a single line scrawled in dark, jagged handwriting. "Turn around." The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me, something heavy and oppressive. I didn't dare move, my breath hitching as I strained to hear. Then, slowly, I turned. The corridor was empty. I bolted back the way I'd come, the flashlight flickering wildly as I ran. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, the whispering following me like a chorus of voices just out of reach. When I reached the staircase, the door at the top was closed. I pounded on it, screaming for help, until the librarian opened it from the other side. Her face was pale, her expression grim as she pulled me through and slammed the door shut. "You shouldn't have gone down there," she said, locking the door with shaking hands. Some things in this library were never meant to be found. I didn't ask what she meant. I never went back to the basement, and I changed my thesis topic the next day. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers in the back of my mind, and I wonder if I left the basement, or if some part of it followed me. The lake cabin. When my family rented the cabin by the lake, it seemed like the perfect getaway. It was tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by towering pines and a serene, glassy lake. My parents were thrilled at the idea of disconnecting from the world for a week, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was too isolated. The first few days were uneventful. We swam in the lake, hiked through the forest, and played board games by the fire at night. But on the third evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something strange. A light was moving across the lake. At first, I thought it was a boat, but there were no sounds of an engine or oars cutting through the water. The light moved smoothly, like it was gliding, and it didn't flicker like a lantern or flashlight. It was steady, cold, and pale. "Hey, does anyone see that?" I asked, pointing out the window. My dad glanced up from his book, frowning. "Probably just a reflection," he said. "Don't worry about it." But I couldn't stop watching. The light continued its slow path across the water, pausing briefly in the center of the lake before disappearing beneath the surface. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint lapping of water against the shore. Just as I started to drift off, I heard it, a soft tapping on the cabin window. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, straining to see through the darkness. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. Summoning my courage, I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The lake was still, the woods silent. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just the wind. But as I turned back to bed, I saw it. Wet footprints leading from the window to the door. I woke my parents, my voice trembling as I told them what I'd seen. My dad grabbed a flashlight and checked the perimeter of the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. The footprints had already faded, the damp wood drying in the cool night air. The next day, I refused to go near the lake. My parents dismissed my fears as nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from beneath the water. That night, the light returned, brighter and closer than before. It hovered just beyond the shore, casting long, shifting shadows across the trees. And then, slowly, it began to move toward the cabin. We left the next morning, cutting our trip short. My parents still joke about my overactive imagination, but I know what I saw, and I know that whatever was in that lake wasn't human. The locked ward. When I started my first job as a nurse, I was assigned to the night shift at an old psychiatric hospital on the edge of town. The building was massive, its halls lined with faded wallpaper and dim, flickering lights. Most of the patients were elderly and harmless, their days spent shuffling through the common areas or sitting quietly in their rooms. But there was one part of the hospital everyone avoided: the old wing. The old wing had been closed for decades. Its doors were locked, its windows boarded up, and its halls left to gather dust. No one ever talked about why it was abandoned, and the few times I asked, I was met with vague answers or nervous glances. One night, during a particularly slow shift, I found myself drawn to the locked doors of the old wing. My curiosity had been building for weeks, and I finally decided to take a closer look. I told myself it was just an empty part of the building, nothing to be afraid of. I found the keys in the supply closet. My hands trembled as I slid the heavy key into the lock, the tumblers clicking loudly in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a dark corridor that smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The air inside was heavy, as if the space itself was holding its breath. I shone my flashlight down the hall, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal rows of empty rooms. The walls were bare, the paint peeling in long, jagged strips. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft thud. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint echo of my footsteps. As I moved farther down the hall, I noticed something strange. Scratches on the walls. They were deep and erratic, as if someone had clawed at the plaster with their bare hands. My stomach churned as I traced the marks with my fingers. A sudden noise made me jump. It was faint, barely audible. A low, shuffling sound coming from one of the rooms ahead. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The shuffling stopped. I peered into the room, my flashlight revealing an old hospital bed, its mattress torn and stained. For a moment, I thought it was empty. Then I saw it. Something moving beneath the bed. It was small and quick, a shadow darting out of sight before I could fully register what it was. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from all around me. "Get out!" The words were barely a breath, but they sent a chill down my spine. I turned and ran, my flashlight swinging wildly as I stumbled back down the hall. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing, filling the corridor with a cacophony of voices. When I reached the door, it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into screams, high-pitched and deafening, as I pounded on the door, tears streaming down my face. Finally, the door flew open, and I fell into the main hallway. One of the other nurses stood there, her face pale. "What were you doing in there?" she demanded, pulling me to my feet. I couldn't answer. I just stared at the door, now firmly shut, the screams fading into silence. I quit a week later. The hospital closed a few years after that, and the old wing was demolished. But sometimes when I pass by the empty lot where it once stood, I swear I can still hear the whispers, faint and accusing, calling me back. The room upstairs. My aunt's house was a sprawling Victorian, filled with antique furniture and dusty old portraits of long-dead relatives. It was beautiful in a haunted sort of way, the kind of place where every creak of the floorboards felt significant. When I was 12, my family stayed there for a weekend. My parents took the guest room on the second floor, while I was given a small room tucked away at the end of the hall. It was a cozy space, with a canopy bed and a large window that overlooked the garden. But there was another room upstairs. It was locked, my aunt told us, and had been for years. "It's just storage," she said when I asked about it. But the way her voice wavered made me think there was more to the story. The first night as I lay in bed, I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from above. At first I thought it was a branch scraping against the roof, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too purposeful. I got up and crept into the hallway, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the tall windows. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting, as I made my way toward the staircase that led to the third floor. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, the sound of the tapping growing louder. When I reached the landing, I saw the door, tall and heavy, its surface scratched and scarred. The handle was rusted, and a thick padlock hung from the latch. The tapping stopped. I stood there, my heart pounding, staring at the door. Then slowly the handle began to turn, the padlock rattling as though someone, or something, was trying to open it. I ran back to my room, slamming the door shut and diving under the covers. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, my ears straining for any sound. But the house was silent. The next morning, I told my aunt what had happened. She grew pale, her hands trembling as she poured herself a cup of tea. "It's just an old house," she said, her voice tight. "You probably imagined it." But I didn't believe her, and the next night, the tapping started again. I never went near the door after that. My family left at the end of the weekend, and I haven't been back to my aunt's house since. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of that locked room, and in my dreams, the door is always open.